Make love, not war.
Don't trust anyone over 30.
I am a human being.
Don't fold, bend, spindle, or mutilate.
Turn on.
Tune in.
And drop out. These were the attitudes of the counterculture movement, made up of rebellious teens that challenged the previous generation's ideas of conformity.
After the war, people sought comfort. World War II gave Americans an unforeseen era of affluence, technological growth, leisure, and opportunities for education and research. New factors pressuring people to conform, and especially to spend more to keep the consumer economy growing, were modern advertising, television, credit cards, and babies.
Speaking of television, the creation of color television was extremely popular with Americans. In fact, by the end of the decade, 95% of homes had at least one TV. Because of this, some Americans began to stop going to the movies. People were able to watch whatever they wanted in the comfort of their own homes. It had a direct and immediate impact on drive-in movie theaters. In 1962, there were 6,000 drive-ins in the U.S. A year later, there were 3,550. Walk-in theaters felt the negative impact as well. Americans felt that they were standing on the dawn of a golden age.
This was an important era not only for minorities, but also for the rise of second-wave feminism. The book, The Feminine Mystique, and the legalization of the birth control pill brought upon a more casual attitude towards sex and the concept of free love. Not only did attitudes change about sex, they also changed, and teens began experimenting with drugs, more communal lifestyle choices, innovations in food, fashion, and music.
As we said before, the counterculture movement was made up of teens and young adults of America. More than 50% of the population was under 18. Their fashion expressed the laid-back vibe of the time period. The mentality was anything goes, but style was typically loose-fitting clothing. Popular prints were psychedelic designs, paisley, op art, and stripes.
The rise of certain patterns and designs stems from the rise of pop art, op art, minimalism, conceptual art, performance art, and feminist arts, among countless other styles and movements. The leading artists of the period were Andy Warhol, Bridget Riley, Donald Judd, Robert Morris, Sol LeWitt, Vito Aconi, and Judy Chicago.
The Third Great Awakening was known as the rise of earth-centered religions, astrological beliefs, and Eastern faiths that spread across American campuses. The teens took to this religious ideology. Vegetarianism also became popular among many youths. Each person tried to celebrate his or her own sense of individuality, and these two things could do that for the youth of this time period.
In addition to change in sexual attitudes, many youth experimented with drugs. Marijuana and LSD were used most commonly, but experimentation with mushrooms and pills were common as well. Timothy Leary made headlines by openly promoting the use of LSD. New freedom came an upsurge of venereal diseases, bad trips, and drug addictions.
The counterculture also seemed to grow more outlandish as the decade wore on. Some people dropped out of political life altogether. As more and more children of middle-class Americans entered college, many rejected the suburban conformity designed by their parents. They abandoned the ideas of traditional marriages. They chose to live in communes, meaning a large gathering of people sharing a common life. Hippies and supporters of the counterculture movement moved to these establishments. With the rise of suburbia, these rural establishments arose, rejecting the capitalist system. Many communes rotated duties, made their own laws, and elected their own leaders.
Later, dudes and dudettes.
Stay psychedelic.
Hi, I'm Cole.
And I'm Andrew, and today we will be discussing the Vietnam War.
American troops intervened in the conflict sparked by the Vietnamese communists in 1965. Lyndon B. Johnson deployed American troops in Vietnam under legislation that allowed him to assist any Southeast Asian country whose government was jeopardized by communist aggression.
The bloody and costly war ripped over 2.5 million Americans from their families and sent them off to the swampy wasteland of Vietnam to fight a guerrilla war against the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops. Guerrilla warfare is used by a small, mobile group of irregular forces using hit-and-run tactics in a territory that is controlled by a large hostile regular force. It became a common event for the civilians to try and avoid the draft by skipping the country for a while. Both sides of both the pro-war and anti-war activists protested at home.
1/3 of the troops were drafted to fight, and the other 2/3 were volunteers. 58,000 of these American troops died in combat fighting till the end. This gruesome conflict lasted around 8 years and finally ended when American troops stopped their occupation of Vietnam in 1973. Although the majority of these brave souls consisted of men, 11,000 women assisted soldiers in Vietnam as nurses, translators, flight controllers, and military band leaders.
About 12.5% of the troops were African American. Compared to a soldier in World War II, For every 1 day of combat a World War II vet saw, a Vietnam vet saw 24 days of combat.
And out of all the soldiers, 1 in every 10 was either wounded or killed. The average age for an infantryman was just about 21 years old, which in reality is 4 years younger than the average soldier for World War II.
It is estimated that in 21 years of fighting, 4 million civilians were killed across North and South Vietnam. It is also thought that about 1.1 million North Korean fighters died. The war caused mass chaos among both North and South Vietnam and left the country in a devastated form. But how did all of this sickening combat in the other side of the globe begin?
Well, the event that sparked this war was the Gulf of Tonkin incident, when the U.S. destroyer Maddox exchanged shots with aggressive North Vietnamese torpedo boats. This conflict, initiated by the Vietnamese on August 2, 1964, granted the Johnson administration abilities to deploy troops in Vietnam and schedule airstrikes.
A second said-to-be incident occurred 2 days later when the Maddox reported to be under fire once again. Although this time the facts of the story appear less clear. Historians have declared that the Maddox was in fact not under fire for a second time that week. Regardless, the Johnson administration ruled the attack was unprovoked and regulated bombings at North Vietnamese boat bases and oil storages.
Overall, this war cost the U.S. military over $111 billion to fund, and cost the lives of over 50,000 American troops, plus many more Vietnamese civilians and troops.
As a country, we must ask ourselves, was it really worth it to join the fighting in this hellish war? Young men were separated from their families either willingly or not to go fight in the war, and social conflicts at home rose higher than ever before.
Hopefully, you've grasped a relative understanding of the Vietnam War after watching this video. See you next time.
T-shirts, stupid bloody Tuesday, man. You've been a naughty boy, you let your face grow long. I am the Eggman. I am the Eggman. I am the...
During the 1960s, protests ran rampant throughout the country. The protests ranged from civil rights at the beginning of the decade to the environment, anti-nuclear bombs and power, gay liberation, and the beginning of second-wave feminism at the end of the decade.
The most prominent set of protests during this period was the anti-war movement against the Vietnam conflict and draft.
More than 15,000 American soldiers were killed in the war, and taxpayer money contributing to it was exceeding $25 billion.
40,000 men were drafted each month. No wonder 100,000 protesters gathered at the Lincoln Memorial in October 1967 to oppose the war.
Most protests were in the form of marches and peaceful gatherings, but in one university in Ohio, protests turned violent.
Around 2,000 protesters gathered at Kent State University to oppose the extension of the Vietnam War into Cambodia, which was announced by President Nixon about 2 weeks earlier. Soon, the National Guard was called to scatter protesters, although no specific legal reason has been found, as the protesters were not violating any laws.
Midday, 29 guardsmen turned their weapons towards the rioting students and fired, injuring 9 and killing 4. After the event and much pressure from the movement, the guardsmen were charged, but were never convicted due to lack of evidence.
On May 14th, students at Jackson State University, an all-black college in Mississippi, began protesting. State highway patrolmen fired on the students, killing 2 and wounding 4. However, the incident went largely overlooked in the media, leading to outrage in the civil rights movement.
The civil rights movement was the most prominent in the 50s and beginning of the 60s. This decade was the start of sit-ins, a form of protest started by black university students sitting at whites-only lunch counters, not leaving until they were served.
As the Vietnam War became a dinner conversation at most American tables, the civil rights protests faded into the background. The war became the focus of political arguments.
President Nixon, a supporter of the Vietnam War, addressed the protesters who were against the war as the vocal minority.
Patriotic Americans have reached different conclusions as to how peace should be achieved. In San Francisco, a few weeks ago, I saw demonstrators carrying signs reading, "Lose in Vietnam, bring the boys home." Well, one of the strengths, any American has a right to reach that conclusion and to advocate that point of view.
60s was a time when Americans stepped away from conformity and began expressing themselves in more creative ways.
One of these creative ways was through fashion. Before the 60s, fashion was for the most part dictated by high-profile designers from top European cities like London, Milan, and Paris.
Some of these designers were Coco Chanel, Christian Dior, and Cristobal Balenciaga.
Once the 60s hit, many young people decided to dictate their own fashion trends. They were tired of the stiff conservative clothing, and they wanted what they wore to express their feelings about raging issues such as the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement.
Some of these trends were brought about like people by Mary Quant, Kate Bush, and Jackie Kennedy.
Mary Quant, a fashion designer of the 60s, brought the London-based mod and youth fashion movement to young Americans. She introduced styles such as the miniskirt and hot pants. Styles such as these encouraged young people to treat fashion as a game. They treated fashion as a game because it allowed them to play around with the clothes they wore and gave them the opportunity to change the rules of fashion. This was manifested by the need to break away from conformity.
Another style icon, Kate Bush, encouraged people to dress in ways they wanted. A subculture known as the hippie movement also emerged during this time. Hippies listened to psychedelic music, embraced the sexual revolution, and experimented with drugs such as marijuana and LSD.
Since drugs influenced the psychedelic lifestyle, the colorful clothing they wore also reflected their way of living. The group scene also strongly influenced the hippies, and when one person found something interesting that the others did, they jumped on the bandwagon and did it too.
Hippies had a distinct style, which included loosely fitted clothing. They wore a lot of tie-dye, psychedelic patterns, and flowered items. With tie-dye, each item is unique and one of a kind. No two tie-dyed garments are quite the same. This appealed to the hippies, who were seeking to express their individuality through one-of-a-kind clothing.
They were strongly influenced by nature, and they went by the motto, anything goes. Hippies wore loose-fitting clothing because they believed that the stiff conservative clothing would not bring them to a closer relationship with nature, which is what they wanted. Hippies wanted an individualized style to reflect the mood of young people of the era.
Another style icon was First Lady Jackie Kennedy. She had a groomed look known as the Jackie look. Many women yearned for this sort of glamour look and modeled their personal styles after her. She sported her pillbox hats, big button suits, and a bouffant hairstyle.
All of these different styles represented the break from conformity and the freedom and happiness of American citizens. This was when clothing became a way for people to express themselves.
Later, flower children, thanks for watching and stick around to catch more about the 60s.
Hey everyone, my name is Antonia.
And I'm Valerie.
The 1960s was the height of television, making it the dominant mass medium around the country.
Radio became less popular as the hours of television watched in each household increased to over 5 hours a day. Radio shows had to be canceled or were transitioned to television broadcasts. There became movies made specifically for TV, meaning a lower budget and shorter production times than theatrical films. These were shown on channels such as NBC and ABC. At movie theaters, the weekly attendance of 44 million people dropped to 17.5 million by the end of the 1960s.
Color TV was introduced in the mid-1950s, but did not become popular until over a decade later in the late 1960s due to its high price and few programs available. In 1964, NBC finally started playing over half of its shows in color. The popular sitcoms, Looney Tunes and Tom and Jerry, originally aired in black and white, but both eventually switched to color.
Conquer freedom's foe. Freedom's foe. Freedom's a foe. Freedom's foe. We're in to win. Our strap is in. So to victory, let's go.
Educational television also started to grow, with PBS being created in 1969. They showed educational films for all ages, but Sesame Street, the children's show, became the biggest of the time and for years on.
Despite the huge leap in the television industry, there were still many big movie productions at the time. The Sound of Music is a classic and favorite of everyone with lots of singing and dancing. Mary Poppins is a fun movie with a magical nanny, which was also very well known. Psycho, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and The Graduate, and To Kill a Mockingbird were also notable movies.
The 1960s, a very expressive cultural period, introduced several advancements in the entertainment industry, where television and movie screens captured the American public and reaching to a broader audience than before.
The introduction of color television and its gained popularity changed the way Americans would view television from then on, causing the vast decrease of radio usage around the country.
Cartoons then changed from black and white to color, capturing the American people, young and old.
TV had now become a staple in every American home, then became an important part of political campaigning, with the Nixon-Kennedy debate being the first televised presidential debate, showing the power of television to the public. That was so bad.
That was...
I pulled into Nazareth, just feeling about half-past dead. Just need to find a place.
The 1960s time period brought around some of the most important events in sports. It was a fantastic era in sports. Muhammad Ali, arguably the greatest boxer of all time, was at the height of his career, knocking out competition left and right, but created some negative publicity when he refused to fight in Vietnam. He was sentenced to prison for 5 years, but the Supreme Court overturned that ruling in 1971.
Ping pong diplomacy was an influential event occurring in 1971. Due to involvement in the Vietnam War, the intense relations with Communist China, the United States and China played in a week-long exhibition table tennis tournament, exchanging players in the process. This led to improved relations between the U.S. and China and helped lead to President Nixon's visit to China in 1972.
On January 15, 1967, the first Super Bowl was played between the Kansas City Chiefs and the Green Bay Packers. For the first time, football was shown in all its glory on national television. The event was broadcasted by both NBC and CBS, the two major news stations at the time. This game marked the beginning of the cultural revolution that the Super Bowl has become today.
Title IX to the Education Amendments was passed on June 23, 1972. It afforded women the opportunity to participate in any educational and athletic events, leading to female participation in college athletics. It also paved the way for the Battle of the Sexes tennis match between female champion Billie Jean King and male champion Bobby Riggs. In front of a sold-out Houston Astrodome, King tactically wore down Riggs and won. This furthered the proposition that women should be able to participate in athletics.
The 1960s and early 70s were also a time of dominance in basketball on both the collegiate and professional levels. In the NBA, the Boston Celtics won 11 out of 16 championships, including 7 in a row from 1959 to 1966. The UCLA Bruins also won 9 out of 16 NCAA championships in that era.
In 1961, Ernie Davis became the first African-American player to win the Heisman Trophy, college football's MVP award. 5 years later, the Texas Western men's basketball team upset the heavily favored Kentucky Wildcats to win the college basketball championship. Texas Western also became the first team to win the championship with an all-African-American starting lineup. They were also the only team other than UCLA to win the national championship from 1965 to 1973. The sports era of the 1960s was one of the most historically significant, as many barriers were broken in terms of race, gender, and culture.
May God bless and keep you always. May your wishes all come true. May you always do for others and let others do for you. May you build a ladder to the stars and climb on every rung. And may you stay forever young.
Hey dudes, I'm Flower.
And I'm Blossom. We were just listening to some totally groovy tunes. During the 60s, music played a large part of the culture. The hippie movement used music to express their rebellious spirit.
Some major artists included the Beatles, The Who, and The Doors. Much like the Beatles in their clip from their swingin' tune, Revolution, many artists of the 60s used their music to call for change.
The Beatles were the main band in the British invasion. The British invasion was a group of British rock bands that came to America in the 60s and grew to considerable fame.
Other main bands of the invasion included the Kinks, the Rolling Stones, and the Who.
The music from the 1960s promoted the counterculture and helped spread its influence throughout society.
A huge part of the counterculture of the 60s was drugs. A lot of music promoted the use of psychedelic drugs like LSD.
main bands who produced psychedelic music were the Doors, the Electric Prunes, and the Count Five.
Psychedelic music and the music from the British invasion are only two genres from this time period. Motown, R&B, folk, roots rock, hard rock, and surf rock also were popular.
Motown consisted of mainly African American groups. Their success in the music industry helped break down the barriers of segregation. Motown also contributed to the start of R&B. R&B combined elements from rhythm and blues, soul, funk, pop, hip-hop, and dance.
Many folk musicians like Bob Dylan, Pete Seeger, and Woody Guthrie wrote their own material.
During this time period, there were many music festivals. The Woodstock Music and Art Fair is regarded as an iconic event that held almost 500,000 hippies enjoying peace, love, and rock music.
The music of the 1960s helped introduce the changing lifestyle and represented the rebellion of the 60s generation. It was very influential and is still often listened to present day.
This has been totally rad. Show me some skin.
Peace out, flower children.